BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. Well, it is another windy and rainy day here in this part of the state, and 2 days ago on the channel we were talking about the case of Riley Crossman, which was sort of, I guess you'd say, an ongoing murder investigation that happened here in the state of West Virginia. But there are some important kind of parallels and similarities that we can talk about with today's case. And yes, that happened 2 days ago. That was one of the first times in a long time that we have not had our 7 episodes for a week from BBOR. We're trying to do at least one a day, but hey, you know, sometimes life happens, and 6 instead of 7, 6 for 7, that's not so bad. Now, we're going to be talking about something on a more serious note, though, and that's the case of Brooke Skylar Richardson. And this one received a lot of national attention about a couple months ago. I mean, they didn't really present her so much by name. They're just referring to her as Ohio cheerleader, who was sentenced as not guilty. I mean, she was found not guilty in the murder of her daughter. And this was a case where you had a teen mom who apparently buried the body of her newborn baby girl in the backyard. Once again, they weren't really addressing her by name. They were calling her just Ohio cheerleader, Ohio teen mom. And there was a very kind of viral video of her crying during the verdict, we should say. And this was, of course, this ended in probation. This received a lot of national attention because people began to question, like, is this a double standard that's going on in terms of Brooke Skylar Richardson's case? Because, of course, Brooke Skylar Richardson is a Caucasian, she's a young white female, and they were just wondering, like, if she had been of a different race, would the verdict have been different? Would this have ended in probation, or would this have ended in serious jail time? Now, I can just leave that up to you guys. I can't really say too much about that right now, because I think there's a much more pressing issue at hand. And the thing, though, to say is, the reason why the trial happened the way it did was, she wasn't even found guilty of anything to do with murder. She was not found guilty of manslaughter. She was not found guilty of accidental death. She was not found guilty of any of that. They had her on the charge of burying a corpse and kind of like defacing a corpse and like burying a corpse without any sort of proper approval. I guess it would sort of be like, and it's illegal, we all know that. Improper disposal of a corpse, that's what I wanted to say. And they were, of course, talking about Brooke Richardson's own daughter. The thing is, though, the defense claimed that the baby had been stillborn, and then kind of in an act of memorial, Brooke Richardson had just done this herself. She had gone to the backyard and buried the girl, whereas the prosecution wanted to say that she had done it purposely, either while the baby was still alive, or she had done something to cause the death of the baby, because she didn't want the responsibilities of being a teen mom, or just being a young mother in general, we should say. But I think that one of the things, though, that the reason why I mentioned the case of Riley Crossman recently was, Riley Crossman was the West Virginia teen that went missing on May 8th of this year, and her body was found on May 16th, 8 days after she was reported missing. The actual incident that caused Riley Crossman's death most likely happened on May 7th, but 8 or 9 days, the forensic evidence had still been preserved, whereas in the case of Brooke Skylar Richardson and her daughter, it wasn't until 2 months after the death of her daughter that they were able to kind of recover the body, and in that case, the forensic evidence had been destroyed. It did not exist. Have you heard of Casey Anthony and her trial? It's almost the same story. Because, like, I was just thinking about this during the Riley Crossman case a lot, because they were somewhat fortunate to be able to be kind of, at least have their forensic evidence preserved so that they could actually go through the proper channels of justice. Whereas in the case of Brooke Skylar Richardson, that evidence just didn't exist. And the reason why they didn't find her guilty on the murder charge was they couldn't determine the cause of death. It's the exact same thing that the jurors said during the Casey Anthony trial. They were not able to determine the cause of death. And then if you can't determine the cause of death, it's very difficult to say that someone was murdered. Or the way that the jurors present this, and like multiple jurors said this after the Casey Anthony trial, that because they couldn't determine the cause of death, there was reasonable doubt that she was murdered. But, in the case of Brooke Skylar Richardson, very clearly, though, they had her on the improper disposal of a corpse charge, and that's what led to her probation. A big thing in Casey Anthony that I had always wondered about was about why wasn't she charged for anything like child endangerment, and why wasn't she charged with the improper disposal of a corpse? And the first one with Casey Anthony was that they weren't able to establish a time frame about when Kaylee Anthony had died, Kaylee being her daughter, of course. So then how do they prove that she would, they couldn't determine how she died and when she died and the circumstances in which she died, so that couldn't come back onto Casey Anthony in terms of child endangerment. And then in terms of the improper disposal of a corpse, the defense team, led by Jose Baez and Cheney Mason, concocted this story where they didn't say that Casey Anthony disposed of the body. They said that her father, George Anthony, just said, "I'll take care of it." They found Kaylee dead in the pool, and they said, "I'll take care of it." So they never had, George Anthony had never been charged with it. In short, the defense team spun circles. And on the one hand, they weren't able to do something like that in the case of Brooke Skylar Richardson. The defense team did not have the ability to spin circles like that to say that someone else had just said, "I'll take care of it." Some of the evidence that was really pointing against Brooke Skylar Richardson in terms of her guilt were just simply that she was posting very shortly after giving birth that, my belly is back now. Now I don't have the baby anymore. My belly is back. And just kind of celebrating the fact that she was going to be thin again and she didn't have the pregnancy. And bear in mind, though, that she hid the pregnancy from her parents as well as from other people. And the only person that supposedly knew about this was her OBGYN. But, of course, she did carry the baby to term. And some people do not show that much when it comes to pregnancy, but also, of course, certain women go to great lengths to hide pregnancy, and there are a variety of ways that they can do about it. And this was also the first time that she had given birth. And just when I'm talking to women and such, they frequently say things like, when someone is kind of having their first child, that the baby bump isn't actually that big, and during the second or third time that they are giving birth, the following times after the first time giving birth, that's when the baby bump actually becomes much larger. But the first time, it's like it isn't always that noticeable. I mean, I'm not 100% sure on that. That is definitely not my area. I'm just totally going off of secondhand information that, I've heard from people over the years. So with the case of Brooke Skylar Richardson, one of the sort of very difficult things to say is just that the jury was in a hard place. I mean, maybe I should have said between a rock and a hard place is the actual expression. I just meant it's a difficult situation that the jury was facing because a lot of the jurors, and I'm just guessing, but they probably wanted to convict her on the murder charge. But based on what we saw from Casey Anthony is just that the forensic evidence gets destroyed during the process of decomposition, and they aren't able to do so. They aren't able to be just like, okay, this girl killed her baby because she didn't want to be a mother. She didn't want the responsibilities of being a mother, so she buried her baby in the backyard. It's possible that she did bury the baby when, the little girl, when she was still alive. But, once again, though, that evidence just isn't there. They can't determine the cause of death. They can't really determine what happened. So then the jury's just like, well, how do we say that this baby was murdered when the evidence has been destroyed? And in the Casey Anthony trial, you really have to wonder about how much was actually calculated. Like, I don't know, is Casey Anthony just a giant slob? Possibly. Did she always keep garbage in her car? Maybe. I mean, she's definitely like the plotting and planning sociopathic type. But, I mean, they went to very great lengths to cover that up. And in the case of Brooke Skylar Richardson, just there isn't that sort of very specific detail that went on to hide the fact that the baby had passed away. I mean, she didn't try and hide it that much. The defense team actually argued that the baby had just been born stillborn, and Brooke Richardson made a little bit memorial outside, actually, in the backyard for her baby, as well as giving the baby a name, and just that was like sort of her coping mechanism. But that's the stuff that the defense team tries and create. That they try to create their own stories. It's just they were not as elaborate as those that were created by Jose Baez and Cheney Mason. Now, when it comes to this, it's just, you really have to wonder about our justice system. After the Casey Anthony trial as well, though, they were just like, this is not a fairness system. This is not about kind of doing what's right. This is not a moral system. This is not an ethical system. This is just the lawyers fighting it out. One side versus the other side. They have to try as hard as they can to win. And I mean, I shouldn't say that there should be zero ethics in law. There are definitely certain ethical things that people should do as lawyers, but it's not about choosing who is the most moral person, and it's not even about believing the truth or anything. I mean, there can be a certain standard of ethics in the way that the lawyers conduct themselves, but they aren't trying to evaluate the ethics of the defendant. It's just about winning. And in this case, I mean, there is a certain sense of honest, reasonable doubt in these cases. Do I think that Brooke Skylar Richardson murdered her baby? Highly likely. Do I think that? Highly likely that she did. But at the same time, the jurors are just like, they're in that very difficult place when they're just like, the evidence has been destroyed. Is there any small possibility that it didn't happen? Beyond the shadow of a doubt. Reasonable doubt. And you know, it's like, if they had kind of found her guilty, I wouldn't have really thought much about it. I wouldn't have, really been, I would have been like, all right, I mean, I guess I can see where you're coming from, but they found her not guilty on the murder charge. And once again, I'm not too surprised about that either, because of the concept of reasonable doubt. The evidence gets destroyed during decomposition, and she perhaps got away with something much more sinister than the way that the defense team describes it. I'm sorry, the way that the prosecution and the defense teams both describe what happened. So, I mean, this just goes to show you that it's a difficult world that we live in, and it is very vital for the forensics teams to be able to kind of locate someone very quickly. And when you see those kind of missing persons posters, or the posters that are asking for additional information to help solve a case, those are very good to be in touch with, and those are very good to stay in contact with if you have anything that could be relevant to a case, to come forward with something like that. And it's a horrible tragedy. It's like, who even knows how long that little baby was alive? That's all the time you get on Earth. I mean, horrible for the kid, horrible for that newborn. But at the same time, our justice system is not perfect. And it definitely doesn't seem like there was any justice brought to that baby, if indeed something destructive did happen on behalf of Brooke Skylar Richardson. But, it's just, in terms of forensics, if the forensics team is not able to examine the body after a very short time, then a lot of the forensic evidence is lost, and then the jury is stuck with less evidence to deal with. So then, if there's less evidence to convict them, if there's less evidence for the prosecution, that often ends up as a not guilty verdict. Just saying that as someone who has just seen this time and time again on true crime shows, court TV, you've seen it too. So that's all I really have to say about the case of Brooke Skylar Richardson. What do you think about this one? If you have any kind of questions or comments to say about the case of Brooke Skylar Richardson, please drop something in the comments section below. I would love to hear from you. That's all from me now, and until next time.